There are words that hit you not because they are loud, not because someone screamed them across a room, or threw something, or slammed a door. Some words hit you quietly. They come out in a normal voice, in a normal kitchen, on a perfectly ordinary Wednesday afternoon. And they land somewhere deep inside you, somewhere that does not make a sound, and they just stay there. My daughter-in-law Sandra said 7 words to me on a Wednesday afternoon that I will never forget for the rest of my life. She said, "This is my house now, not yours." She did not shout. She did not cry. She did not even look particularly angry. She was standing at the kitchen counter, stirring something in a pot, and she said those 7 words the way you might say, "The weather is a little cold today." Matter of fact. Settled. Like she had been thinking it for a long time and had finally just decided to say it out loud. I was standing by the kitchen door. I had come in to make myself a cup of tea. I had walked into that kitchen 10,000 times before that afternoon. I had made tea in that kitchen every single day for 42 years. 42 years of mornings and evenings and quiet afternoons in that kitchen. And on that Wednesday, I stood by the door with my hand still on the handle, and Sandra stirred her pot, and those 7 words hung in the air between us like smoke. I did not say anything back to her. I just let go of the door handle, turned around, and walked back down the hallway to my room. My slippers made soft sounds on the floorboards. The hallway looked exactly the same as it always had. The same faded patch on the wall where my husband Harold's chair used to scrape when we moved it. The same strip of afternoon light that came through the little window above the front door and fell on the floor every day at that time. Everything was the same, except something had changed. Something inside me had shifted. Like when you move a piece of furniture that has been sitting in the same spot for years, and even after you move it back, the floor underneath looks different. Lighter. More exposed. I sat down on the edge of my bed. I folded my hands in my lap, and I thought about Harold. I thought about the day we moved into that house. I thought about how young we were, how full of hope. I thought about how Harold had carried me over the threshold, and we had both laughed because he had almost dropped me. I thought about every single thing that had happened inside those walls in the 42 years between that day and this one, and then I made myself a cup of tea in my room. With the little kettle I had put there months ago, when I had started to understand, slowly, the way you understand things you do not want to understand, that the kitchen was no longer entirely my space. Let me tell you the whole story, from the very beginning. My name is Florence. I turned 71 last April. My children came, and we had a quiet lunch in the garden, and there was a chocolate cake that my grandsons helped decorate. It had too much icing on it. It was perfect. I was born the 5th of 7 children. My parents were ordinary, hard-working people who did not have much, but gave what they had freely. My mother was the kind of woman who could feed 12 people with what was meant for 4, and she did it without complaint and without making anyone feel like they were getting less than they deserved. I learned a great deal from watching my mother. I met Harold when I was 19 years old. He was 22. He had a slow smile and quick hands. He was good at fixing things, Harold was. Any broken thing you brought him, he would look at it quietly for a moment and then start working on it with his hands, and 9 times out of 10, he would have it working again within the hour. He used to say that everything that is broken just wants to be understood before it can be fixed. I thought he was talking about objects. It took me many years to understand that he was talking about people too. We married when I was 21. We were not wealthy. We were not even comfortable, not in the early years. We rented a small flat, and Harold worked as an electrician, and I worked part-time in a laundry, and we saved every single coin we could. We had a tin on the shelf in the kitchen where we put our savings. We called it the house tin. Every week, no matter how small the amount, something went into the house tin. It took us 7 years. 7 years of the house tin and the small flat and the careful living. And then, when our son Arthur was 4 years old and our daughter Patricia was 2, we bought our house. It was not a grand house. It had 3 bedrooms and a small garden and a kitchen that was just big enough for 2 people to work in comfortably if neither of them was particularly tall. The floorboards creaked in the hallway. The bathroom tiles were a shade of green that nobody would have chosen on purpose. But it was ours. Completely, entirely ours. Harold carried me over the threshold. We had done the same thing when we moved into our first rented flat, and it had become our tradition. He nearly dropped me, and we both laughed, and Arthur stood beside us watching with a serious face that 4-year-olds have when they think the adults are being foolish. We lived in that house for the rest of Harold's life. 42 years. Arthur grew up in that house. Patricia grew up in that house. They learned to ride bicycles on the path outside. They did their homework at the kitchen table. They brought their first friends home. They had their first arguments in those rooms. They grew tall enough to look Harold in the eye. And then they grew old enough to leave. Patricia left first. She moved to the north for her studies and then met her husband there and stayed. She calls every Sunday without fail. She is my reliable one, steady and warm, and the kind of person who never forgets a birthday. Arthur stayed closer. He got a job in the same city. He met Sandra at a work event when he was 32. And when he was 34, he brought her to our house for Sunday lunch. I want to describe that first Sunday lunch carefully because I think about it often now. I think about all the small signs I saw, but did not quite read properly because I was too busy hoping for the best. Sandra was well-dressed and confident. She shook hands rather than hugged, which is not unusual, but which tells you something about a person. She looked around the house when she came in, not rudely, not obviously, but in the way of someone taking inventory. Her eyes moved around the room with a quiet, measuring quality, like an assessor visiting a property. I noticed it, and I told myself it was nothing. People look around when they enter a new place. That is perfectly natural. Lunch was pleasant. Harold was still alive then. This was 4 years before his heart gave out, and Harold had a way of putting people at ease. He asked Sandra questions about her work and listened to the answers with genuine interest. She softened a little under his attention. Most people did. But there was a moment, one small moment, that I stored somewhere in the back of my mind without fully knowing why. Harold offered Sandra more potatoes, and she said, "Oh, thank you, Harold. Gosh, this house is good bones, doesn't it? You could really do something with it if you updated a few things." Harold smiled and said, "We like it the way it is." Sandra laughed pleasantly and said, of course," and she helped herself to more potatoes. I looked at her over the table. She was looking at the walls, thinking something that she was not quite saying. I could see it, but I put it away, because Arthur was looking at this woman the way that men in love look at the people they have chosen. And I loved my son, and I wanted to love whoever he had chosen. Arthur and Sandra married 2 years later. We held the reception in the garden of our house. Sandra's parents' home was in another country, and it seemed simpler, and we were glad to do it. I cooked for 3 days beforehand. Harold hung lights in all the trees. The garden looked beautiful, and for a while, a good, long while, things were genuinely fine. Sandra was not unkind in those early years. She was reserved. She was particular. She had strong opinions about how things should be done, and she expressed them freely, which I respected even when I did not always agree. She and Arthur bought a flat on the other side of the city and built their life there. They visited us on Sundays most weeks. I would cook the big meal, and Harold would sit at the head of the table, and it felt like the way family is supposed to feel. And then Harold died. He was 69. A heart attack, sudden and complete, on a Tuesday morning while he was making breakfast. He was holding a cup of tea when it happened. I was in the garden. The cup was still warm when I found it on the counter. I will not linger on the grief. Not because it was small. It was enormous. It is still enormous in ways that do not shrink with time, only become more familiar. I will just say that losing Harold was like losing the person who knew all the same things I knew, who remembered all the same things I remembered, who had been there for every single chapter of my life that mattered. When he died, there was suddenly no one left who knew me completely. That is a particular kind of loneliness that I do not think has a name. Arthur and Sandra started spending more time at the house after Harold died, which I was grateful for. Truly, the house felt very big and very quiet without Harold in it. Having Arthur's car in the driveway on a weekend felt like company even before he came through the door. Sandra began to involve herself more in the house, helping me with things, she said. And I accepted the help because I needed it and because I believed, as I have always believed, that help offered in good faith should be received in good faith. But I want to be honest with you now, the way I could not be honest with myself then. There is a difference between helping and taking over, between caring and controlling. And the line between those two things can be very blurry when the person crossing it is doing so gradually and gently, and always with a reason that sounds perfectly sensible in the moment. The first time I felt it, really felt it, in the way you feel something that is true even when you want it not to be, was about 8 months after Harold passed. Arthur had suggested, very gently, that I might want to think about renting out the spare bedroom. Just for the company, Mom, he said. And the extra money wouldn't hurt. I said I would think about it. 2 weeks later, Sandra arrived with a paint chart. She said she had been thinking about it, and if I was going to rent out the spare room, it needed freshening up. And while she was at it, the hallway could use a coat too. And really, the whole downstairs felt a bit dark, didn't I think? She said all of this the way she said most things, pleasantly, efficiently, with the air of someone who has already made the decision and is now just walking you through it for the sake of politeness. I said that I was happy with how the house looked. She said, Florence, I know you love it as it is. But things do date, you know. She left the paint chart on the kitchen table. I put it in the recycling bin that same evening. She never mentioned it again. But something had shifted. Something small but real. Arthur and Sandra started coming over more frequently. Then they started staying for long weekends. Then, 6 months after Harold's death, Arthur sat me down and proposed what he called a more practical arrangement. He said that the house was too big for one person. He said that he and Sandra had been talking and they thought it made more sense, financially, practically, emotionally, if they moved in with me. They could help with the bills. They could help with the maintenance. I would have company. It was, he said, the sensible thing. I looked at my son's face while he said all of this. He meant it kindly. I know that. Arthur has never had a malicious bone in his body. He was genuinely worried about me rattling around alone in a 3-bedroom house, and his worry was genuine. His love for me was genuine. But underneath the kind words, I heard something else. Something I could not name at the time, but which I can name now. I heard Sandra. The reasoning was too polished, too thought through. Arthur has always been a spontaneous, warm-hearted man. He plans things, but he does not present plans. Sandra presents plans. The orderly way it was laid out, the financial argument, the practical argument, the emotional argument in neat sequence. That was Sandra's doing, even if Arthur's voice was the one saying the words. I said yes. What else could I do? I was a widow of 6 months, alone in a large house, and my son wanted to come home. You do not say no to that. You cannot say no to that, even when something quiet inside you is not entirely sure. They moved in 2 months later, and they brought Leo and Marcus with them, my grandsons, 8 and 6 years old at the time. And I want to tell you that those 2 boys, those noisy, messy, laughing little boys, were the single greatest comfort of everything that followed. Every difficult thing that happened in that house during those years, I could always balance against the weight of Leo climbing into my lap after school and Marcus bringing me his drawings to stick on my bedroom wall. Children are a kind of grace that adults forget to be grateful for until they really need it. But Sandra moved into that house, and within 3 months, it no longer felt like my house. Again, it was never dramatic. It was never one single moment you could point to and say that is when it changed. It was 100 small moments. A pattern that only becomes clear when you step back and look at it from a distance. She reorganized the kitchen. She said she needed to know where things were. She put my things in the back of the cupboard and her things at the front. She started buying different washing up liquid because she preferred a different brand. She changed the brand of tea in the tea tin, even though she knew I had bought the same brand for 40 years. When I mentioned it, she said, "Oh, that one's a bit strong, isn't it? This one is nicer. You'll get used to it." I did not want to get used to it. It was my tea tin. She started making decisions about the house without asking me. She had a new lock put on the front door, a digital one, with a code instead of a key. She showed me how to use it, as though I were a child who needed to be taught to use a light switch. She bought a new sofa for the living room without mentioning it to me beforehand. When the old sofa, the one that Harold and I had chosen together, the one I had sat in every evening for 15 years, was taken away by the removal man, I stood in the doorway and watched it go and did not say a word. Because what would I have said? And to whom? Arthur noticed some of it. I could see that he noticed. He would sometimes look between Sandra and me with an expression that was caught somewhere between guilt and helplessness. But he was a man who loved both the women in that room, and he had made a life with one of them, and the weight of that shapes the choices a person makes. I started spending more and more time in my room, not because anyone told me to, but because it was the one room in the house where nothing had been moved or changed or replaced. My things were in the same places they had always been. Harold's photograph was on a nightstand. The book I was reading was on the chair. The The window looked out onto the rose bush that Harold had planted the spring before he died, and which I tended every week without fail. In my room, I was still Florence, still the woman who had built this life and kept this home and raised her children in these walls. Outside my room, I was becoming something else, something I did not have a word for, something between a guest and a ghost. The boys helped. Leo and Marcus would come to my room every evening before dinner and sit with me and tell me about their days. Leo was the talker. He would give me a complete account of everything that had happened at school, every conversation, every injustice, every triumph, in exact detail. Marcus was quieter, but he would bring things to show me. A stone he had found that he thought looked like a face. A drawing he had made of our garden. Once he brought me a snail in a matchbox, very carefully, and presented it with great solemnity, and I had to work very hard not to laugh. Those boys were my tether, my reason for staying gentle, because there were evenings when Sandra would say something, or do something, or simply look at something in a certain way, and something in me would flare up briefly, a hot, angry feeling that I'm not used to and do not know well. And in those moments, I would think about Leo and Marcus. I would think about being the kind of grandmother they could come home to, and the feeling would settle. But feelings, even when you settle them, leave a mark. They accumulate, and the accumulation was building. One Sunday, Patricia came to visit. She had come down from the north for the week. Patricia had not been to the house since Sandra and Arthur had moved in, and I watched her face as she walked through the door and looked around. She is a perceptive woman, my Patricia. She did not say anything. She hugged me, and she smiled at Sandra, and she sat down at the kitchen table. But later that evening, when we were in my room together after dinner, she took my hands and looked at me very carefully and said, "Mom, are you all right? Really?" I said, "I'm managing." She said, "This doesn't feel like your house anymore." I looked at her. I wanted to tell her to lower her voice. I wanted to tell her she was imagining it. I wanted to tell her everything was fine. Instead, I said, "No, it doesn't." And she held my hands tighter. And we sat like that in silence for a while. The way women who love each other sit when words are not quite enough. Patricia spoke to Arthur before she left. I do not know what was said, but there was a quietness in the house the day after she went back north. A careful, stretched kind of quiet that is the particular silence of two people who have had a difficult conversation and are now stepping around each other. And then came the Wednesday. I have already told you about the Wednesday, about the 7 words, but I want to tell you more about what happened in the days that followed. Because the words were just the beginning. What came after them was the part that truly broke something open in me. After I went to my room that afternoon, I sat for a long time. I did not cry. I am not, by nature, a person who cries easily. Harold used to say that I process things deeply but quietly, like a river that looks still on the surface, but is moving fast underneath. He was right about that. I sat and I thought. I thought about the house tin. I thought about the 7 years of saving. I thought about carrying Harold's tools into this house on the first day. I thought about painting the children's bedrooms, Arthur's blue, Patricia's yellow, and how the smell of the paint had taken weeks to fully fade. I thought about every room in this house, and what had happened in each one, every piece of living that had been done inside these walls. And then I thought, does any of that matter to Sandra? Does she know any of it? Does she know about the house tin? Does she know about the cold winter when the boiler broke, and we slept in the living room for a week because it was the only room warm enough? Does she know that the rose bush in the garden was planted by her father-in-law 3 months before he died, and that I water it every week without fail because it is the only growing thing left that he touched with his own hands? I do not think she knows any of it. And I think, and this is the hardest thing to admit, that she may not want to know, because knowing might make things more complicated, and Sandra likes things to be unambiguous. That evening, Arthur came to my room. He knocked, which he always did. He sat in the chair by the window. He looked uncomfortable. He said, "Mom, Sandra told me what she said. I want you to know I didn't. I didn't know she was going to say that." I looked at him. I said, "But is she wrong, Arthur?" He opened his mouth, closed it again. I said, "Is she wrong about what she thinks? Not about how she said it, about what she thinks." He looked at the window, at the rose bush outside. He said, after a long time, "She feels like she can't fully settle here. She says she never knows quite where she stands." I said, "Where does she think I stand?" He rubbed the back of his neck. He said, "She says," and I'm just telling you what she said, Mom, she says it feels like two women in one house, and there's only room for one set of rules. I thought about that. I thought about it carefully and fairly, the way Harold had always taught me to think about things, by trying to understand the other person's position, even when it was uncomfortable. And I thought, maybe she's not entirely wrong. Maybe there is something true in that, even if the way she said it was wrong. Two women who both feel that a space belongs to them will always be in tension, no matter how much goodwill exists on either side. That is not a failing. It is just a human truth. But here is what Sandra had not considered, or had considered and dismissed. This was not two houses. This was my house. The house I had built and paid for, and lived in for 42 years. It was not a neutral space where two equal parties were both trying to establish themselves. One of us had been here for 4 decades. The other had been here for 18 months. And that difference matters. I said to Arthur, "When you bought this house, whose name was on the deed?" He said, very quietly, "Yours and Dad's." I said, "And now whose name is on it?" He said, "Yours, Mom." I said, "Then I think you both need to think carefully about what that means. And I need to think carefully about what I'm going to do." He looked alarmed. He said, "Mom, I don't want you to feel like you have to." I said, "I'm not going to do anything tonight. I'm going to sleep. We'll talk tomorrow." He nodded. He stood up. At the door he stopped and turned back and said, "Mom, I'm sorry." And I could see that he meant it. "My son, my good caught in the middle son." I said, "I know you are." He closed the door softly behind him. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in the dark, and I listened to the house. The familiar creaks. The sound of the wind in the garden. The distant murmur of Arthur and Sandra talking in their room. Not loud enough to hear the words, just enough to know they were talking. I lay there, and I thought about Harold, and I asked him what he would do. The way I had been asking him things since he died, in the private conversations you have with people who are gone. He never answered. Of course he did not. But the act of asking helped me think. And what I thought was this. I had spent 18 months making myself smaller so that Sandra could feel bigger. I had moved back from the kitchen, from the living room, from every shared space, one quiet retreat at a time. I had done it without being asked and without complaint because I had believed that making space for someone was the kind thing to do. But I had confused making space with disappearing. And those are not the same thing. The next morning was Thursday. I got up before anyone else was awake. I went to the kitchen, my kitchen, and I made a pot of tea with my own tea bags, which I had brought from my room. I sat at the kitchen table. I sat in the center of the table, not at the far end, where I had been sitting for the past year without realizing I had gradually migrated there. I sat in the center. I was on my second cup when Sandra came in. She stopped when she saw me. A small hesitation. Then she moved to the counter and started making coffee. I said, "Sandra, will you sit with me for a moment?" She turned. She looked at me. She had her composed face on, the one that she wore when she was preparing for something. She sat down, not next to me, across from me. I said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer me honestly, not politely." She nodded. Cautious. I said, "Do you want me to leave this house?" The question sat between us. A moment passed. Then she said, "That's not what I said, "I know that's not what you said. I'm asking what you want." She pressed her lips together. She looked at the table. And then, to her credit, and I do give her credit for this, she did not lie to me. She said, "I want this to feel like our home. Mine and Arthur's. And right now it doesn't. It feels like I'm living in someone else's house. And I can't. I don't know how to stop feeling that." I looked at this woman. I thought about what she had just given me. An honest thing. A vulnerable thing. Harder to say than 7 dismissive words stirred into a pot. I said, "I understand that feeling. And I don't think you're a bad person for feeling it." She looked up, surprised. I said, "But Sandra, I need you to understand something too. This is my home. Not in the sense that I want to hold it over you, but in the sense that it is woven into me. Harold is in these walls. My children's childhoods are in these floors. 42 years of my life are in this house. And when you say to me that this is your house now, not mine, you are not just making a statement about space. You are asking me to erase all of that. And I cannot do that. I will not know how." She was very still. I said, "I think the question we need to answer is not whose house this is. The question is whether this house is big enough for both of us to be real in it. Not for one of us to shrink so the other one can breathe. But for both of us to actually be here. Sandra looked at me for a long time, and something in her face, I did not know exactly what it was, but something shifted, very slightly. The way light changes when a cloud moves overhead. Just a small change, but enough to notice. She did not say anything, but she did not leave either. We sat together in that kitchen in silence for a little while. And it was not an easy silence. It was not a comfortable silence, but it was an honest one. The days that followed were difficult in the specific way that days are difficult after something true has finally been said out loud. When you keep something buried for a long time and then it rises to the surface, the first thing you feel is not relief. The first thing you feel is rawness, like a wound that has been covered and is now exposed to the air. It stings. Everything feels tender and uncertain. Arthur moved through the house carefully in those days, watching, worried. He would bring me cups of tea and sit with me for a while without talking much, and I appreciated the company more than I could say. Leo and Marcus sensed that something had happened. Children always sense things, and they were quieter than usual. Marcus brought me 3 drawings in 1 week, which was his way of being kind without having words for it. Sandra and I were polite with each other. Carefully, consciously polite, which is not warmth, but it is a beginning. And then, about a week after our kitchen conversation, something happened that I did not expect. I was in the garden. It was a Saturday morning, mild and gray, and I was tending the rose bush the way I always did on Saturdays. I was crouched down near the base of it, clearing some dead growth away from the roots, talking to Harold the way I sometimes did when no one was around to hear me. I heard the back door open. I looked up. Sandra came out. She was carrying 2 cups of tea. She walked across the garden. She was wearing shoes that were not entirely suitable for a garden, the kind of shoes that tell you someone is not used to gardens, and she held one of the cups out to me. I took it. She looked at the rose bush. She said, "Arthur told me Harold planted this." I said, "He did. 3 months before he died." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "It's beautiful." I said, "He was good with plants. Better than with most things. Actually, he could always tell what something needed just by looking at it." She crouched down beside me, carefully, in those unsuitable shoes, and she looked at the rose bush up close. She said, "What kind is it?" I said, "It's called a peace rose. Harold chose it on purpose. He said he wanted something that would outlast arguments." She looked at it a little longer, and then she said, without looking at me, "Florence, I have been thinking about what you said in the kitchen, about whether there's room for both of us to be real in this house." I waited. She said, "I think I've been doing it wrong. I've been thinking about this as a problem to solve. Like there's a version of this arrangement that works, and I just need to engineer it correctly. And I think the way I've been trying to engineer it is by making you smaller. And I didn't let myself see that until you said it to me." I looked at this woman beside me. She was not looking at me. She was looking at Harold's rose bush with an expression that I can only describe as working through something painful. She said, "When I came to this house as Arthur's wife, I think I thought that because I was his wife, this was going to be my home. And I couldn't understand why it didn't feel that way. And instead of asking myself why, or talking to Arthur properly about it, I just pushed, and I pushed in the wrong direction." She stopped, took a breath. She said, "I'm sorry for what I said to you. About the house. It was unkind. And it wasn't even true. It was fear, I think. I was afraid that I was always going to be the outsider here. And fear made me say a cruel thing." I looked at my tea. I thought about Harold. I thought about what he used to say, that everything that is broken just wants to be understood before it can be fixed. I said, "Why are you afraid of being an outsider here?" She said, "Because I never know if I'm enough. For Arthur. For the boys. For any of it. And every time I'm in a room where you've been here 40 years and I've been here 18 months, I feel that not enough feeling very loudly." I set down my tea. I looked at this woman, this young woman, who was 38 years old and had 2 sons and a husband and a life that she was trying to hold together in a house that was not built for her in any of the ways it was built for me. And I understood something I had not understood before. She was not trying to take anything from me. She was trying to build something for herself. And she had gone about it badly, and she had hurt me in the process, and none of that was acceptable. But underneath it was not malice. It was a kind of reaching, The same kind of reaching that people do when they are afraid of not belonging. I know that feeling. I know in a different context, but I know it. I said, Sandra, you are enough. You do not have to prove that by removing me. She blinked. I could see that the words had reached somewhere. I said, this house can hold both of us. It always could, but it requires something from both of us. It requires that we stop treating each other as obstacles and start treating each other as people. She nodded. She looked at Harold's rose bush. She said, very quietly, can we start again? Not pretend the past year didn't happen, but start again from here. I picked up my tea. I thought about it genuinely. I did not rush to say yes because the moment required yes. I actually thought about it. And then I said, yes, but slowly and honestly. No more polite performances. She almost smiled. She said, I'm not very good at slowly. I said, I know, but you can learn. We sat in the garden together for another 20 minutes. We did not talk very much, but we were both present, really present, in the same space without one of us bracing against the other. And that was more than we had managed in 18 months. Arthur was watching from the kitchen window. I could see him from where I was sitting. He saw me look up and he raised his hand, just slightly a small wave. I gave him a small nod. He exhaled in a way I could see, even from the garden. In the weeks that followed, things changed. Not all at once. Not completely, but genuinely. Sandra asked me one morning if I would teach her how to make the chicken stew that the boys love so much. Not because she needed to learn. She knew how to cook. She asked because she was trying to enter something that she had been standing outside of. And I recognized the attempt. And I said yes, come on then. We stood in the kitchen together. My kitchen, our kitchen, and I taught her the recipe the way my mother had taught me. Sandra was a quick learner. She asked good questions. By the end, she had made an excellent stew, honestly better in some ways than mine, because she used a spice I did not usually use, and it worked beautifully. Leo ate 2 bowls and told his mother and me that we were both amazing cooks, which was the kind of diplomatic compliment that a 9-year-old probably learns from watching the adults around him negotiate. Sandra put Harold's photograph back on the hallway wall. She did not announce it. It simply appeared one evening, back in its original spot, in the correct light. I walked past it and touched the frame briefly and kept walking. But I felt something settle. She did not return the sofa. I did not expect her to. Some things are gone, and they are gone. But the photograph was something. It was a signal. The signal that I think we both needed. I want to tell you about the Sunday, 3 months later, when Patricia came back to visit. She walked through the front door and she looked around the house, just as she had done the last time. And I watched her face. I watched it carefully. She turned to me after a moment, and she said, Mom, something is different. I said, yes. She said, what happened? I said, we talked. Sandra and I really talked. Patricia looked at Sandra, who was in the kitchen with Arthur. And Sandra looked back at her. And there was a moment between them, a measuring kind of moment, the way women sometimes assess each other. And then Patricia said, well, something smells wonderful. Sandra said, Florence's chicken stew. We made it together. Patricia raised her eyebrows at me. I shrugged modestly. She laughed. We all had lunch together that Sunday. Arthur and Sandra and Leo and Marcus and Patricia and me, around that kitchen table that I had eaten at for 42 years. And it felt different. It felt like a family, rather than a collection of people sharing a difficult space. Leo had started calling me Grandma Flo again, which he had quietly stopped doing in the difficult months. Children absorb the tension of adults, and it comes out in small, unconscious ways. Marcus had brought Harold's photograph, which I had not even told him was back on the wall, to show his Aunt Patricia as something he was proud of. That's great-granddad Harold, he said, with the authority of a 7-year-old presenting an important fact. He planted the rose outside. Grandma Flo looks after it. Patricia looked at the photograph. She looked at me. Her eyes were a little bright. She said, yes, he did. And Marcus put the photograph back on the hallway wall, very carefully, with both hands. In the months that followed, Sandra and I developed something that I do not think either of us expected. We developed a friendship. Not a deep, decades-long one. Those take time that we do not yet have. But a real one, built on honest things, not polite performances. She would sit with me in the evenings sometimes, in the garden if the weather was good. She was learning the garden slowly. She was still not natural in it. She still wore the wrong shoes, but she was trying. She learned the names of all the roses. She remembered that the one Harold planted needed the most water in dry spells. She told me things about herself, her childhood, growing up moving between countries because of her father's work, never fully settling anywhere, never having a place that felt entirely hers for long enough to call a home. And I heard in that, I really heard, the roots of what had happened between us. She had come into my house, and she had been afraid, more deeply afraid than even she understood, of not belonging. And that fear had come out in the only way she knew how to express it, as control. I did not excuse it, but I understood it. And understanding is not the same as excusing. Understanding is what allows you to build forward. She asked me once, just once, and very carefully, whether I had ever thought of leaving, of going to live with Patricia, or finding somewhere smaller. And I could see that she was asking not because she wanted me to leave, but because she wanted to know how close we had come to losing each other, how close she had come to the thing she had actually been afraid of, making everything worse. I said, I thought about it. I will not lie to you. She said, what made you stay? I thought about it. I looked at the garden. I thought about Harold and the rose bush and the house 10 and 42 years of living inside those walls. I said, Harold always said that everything broken just wants to be understood. I thought it was worth one more try. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm glad you did. I said, so am I. And I meant it. I am 71 years old. I still live in my house. The house that Harold and I built with 7 years of the house 10 and careful living and hope. The house where our children grew up and where Harold died and where I have kept going because there is something in these walls that is mine in a way that nothing can fully take away. Sandra and I have been building something together for just over a year now. There are still moments of friction. There are still Wednesdays, not with cruel words, but with the ordinary friction of two women with strong opinions sharing one kitchen. I do not always agree with how she does things. She does not always agree with how I do things. But we talk now. We actually talk. Not around things, but through them. And that changes everything. Arthur has become himself again in this house. In the difficult months, he had become thin and anxious in a way that had nothing to do with his body, a tightness in him, a perpetual bracing. Now he is warmer, more present. He sits with me in the evenings, sometimes the way he used to when he was younger, and had something on his mind. And we talk the way a son and a mother should talk. Leo is 10 now. He has shot up about 4 inches in the past year, and is terribly proud of being nearly as tall as his father. He still tells me everything that happens at school. Everything, at great length and in exact detail. And I listen with full attention because the gift of being told everything by someone you love is not one you take for granted. Marcus is 8. He has started drawing the garden. He sits in the back garden on weekends with his sketchbook, and he draws the rose bush, Harold's rose bush, over and over from different angles. He gives me one drawing a week. They are getting better and better. The rose bush, in Marcus's drawings, has become something slightly magical, larger than it really is, fuller, more luminous. The way children see things that are precious to the people they love. They see them more true, somehow, than they really are. Harold's photograph is on the wall in the hallway. It has not moved. I want to tell you what I have learned from all of this. Not as a lecture, not as a moral tagged onto the end of story, but as the simple truth of an old woman who has had time to think. I learned that when someone is trying to erase you, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to disappear. Not noisily, not angrily, but quietly and with full dignity. You stay present. You keep tending your rose bush. You keep drinking your own tea from your own tin. You keep being yourself in your own space, gently and without apology. Because you cannot love someone into treating you with respect if you are busy shrinking yourself to make them comfortable. I learned that people who hurt us are almost never doing it from pure cruelty. They are doing it from fear. And fear is something that can be met if you have the patience and the steadiness to do it. Sandra was afraid of not belonging. She needed to understand that she could belong without me having to leave. Once she understood that, truly understood it, the person I found underneath the fear was someone I could actually know. I learned that the things we build with our hands and our years and our love, whether it's a home, a family, a garden, those things do not become less ours just because someone tells us they are. Ownership is not only in a deed. It is in the knowledge of every creak in the floor, It is in the memory of the paint color that was chosen on a Sunday afternoon in a little shop in town. It is in the rose bush planted 3 months before the end of a good man's life. No 7 words can take that away. No reorganized kitchen. No new sofa. No digital lock on the front door. Because the things that matter most, the ones built with time and love and the kind of ordinary dedication that does not ask for credit, those things live inside you. They live in a place that no one else can reach. Harold knew that. He used to say that what you put into a place comes back to you in the end. That love leaves a mark. That care leaves a mark. That a life well lived inside a set of walls leaves something behind that cannot be repainted or replaced. I believe him. I see it every morning when I walk down the hallway and the light from the little window above the front door falls on the floor in the same spot it has always fallen, at the same time, in the same light. Everything that mattered is still there. And the rose bush is blooming again this spring. It always does. Harold knew how to choose a plant that would last. I tend it every Saturday. And sometimes Sandra comes out in her unsuitable garden shoes and stands beside me and watches. And sometimes she crouches down and touches the leaves. And sometimes we talk, and sometimes we just stand there together in the quiet of a Saturday morning. And it is enough. More than enough. It is, in the end, exactly what a home is supposed to be.